The title of this video is about the table legs, but I'm actually building the whole table. So if you just want to see the table legs, skip forward to 5 minutes and 33 seconds. Rachel wanted a little table right here for the kids to do their crafts on, so it wouldn't always be on the kitchen table. So I moved this little desk here, but it's not the perfect size for it, so I'm going to build another one. This will be the top, this will be the edge trim, and this will be the legs. Now I'm just going to cut it to size. And I'm just making a shallow scoring cut before making a full depth cut to avoid tear out. And I'm ripping off a few millimeters off of one side because that edge isn't entirely straight. And just by running it up against a fence, that'll make it straight, sort of like a jointer. And like the other cut, I'm making a shallow cut followed by a full depth cut. And this used to be part of a headboard that I picked up off the curb, and I'm cutting a narrow piece off of this. That'll form the trim for the ends of the plywood. And then cutting two much wider pieces off of that, that'll make the trim for the long edges of the tabletop. I'm planing 0.5 millimeter off of all those boards to get rid of the varnish, and I like to keep the planer fed continuously. That way I only get snipe at the start of the first board and at the end of the last board. This is how the trim's going to go on. For the sides, the trim is a lot wider because that's going to help stiffen that table against bending. And that trim's going to get attached with some floating tenons like this, which will make for a nice strong connection. I'm going to cut the mortises for those floating tenons on my slot mortiser, and for the trim I can just use this work holding clamp here, but when I put the big piece of plywood on here, that has to go, and then I kind of have to come in from the edge here like this, and wouldn't it be better to just come in right here, except the dust guard is in the way, so I should have done this a long time ago. I'm going to kind of hold in that dust guard to put a clamp through. Now transferring the mortise locations onto the trim piece that goes on there. And now back to my other work holding clamp. This clamp is actually some kind of a weird hybrid between a bar clamp and a C-clamp. And I just discovered it when I was looking for a clamp for my slot mortiser back in 2009, and I bought it. Perfect for this job, but it was discontinued, and I wish I could buy another one like that. And now I actually have a project where I can use those edge clamps that Maris Hornberger gave me. But it turns out I needed a lot more force to squeeze that joint shut, so I'm using this $100 clamp that I bought as a comparison to Maris's clamps, and that one will clamp a lot harder. But having a bunch of Maris's clamps is very handy because I can use those to hold it shut after I use the big clamp to really force it shut. Now those bar clamps sticking underneath the slot mortiser table worked out really well, but they kept wobbling around. So I decided to add some little blocks to kind of hold the end of the clamp so it stays upright. Now for the one that's closer to the router, I had to be very careful with that block. I didn't want to make it too big because right around here is also where the pad of the big blue clamp goes when I'm using it. So the block here is made rather narrow. And with the glue now dry on the trim on the ends of the table, I can trim that flush so I can put the trim on the long edges of the table. But first I have to cut 8 mortises along the edge for the floating tenons to attach that trim. And with that many joints that need to meet up at the same time, it's always stressful. And I'm not using any edge clamps because my bar clamps can easily reach across the table and they're just so much stronger. Two of the clamps I'm using here are these quick grip type of clamps, and those ones also just don't have enough clamping force. So I have to rely on the screw clamps, especially the ones with a star knob on there, because it's just much easier to really crank those down, and you can really see how the bar bends when I clamp. Aside from not having quite the strength to really force this shut, these ones just don't have the reach for this super wide piece of trim. This one might almost work, and it does have the strength, but I've only got one because they're super expensive. Now I just need legs to go on the underside of that tabletop. I needed something big and round to mark that curvature for the layout of the table legs. And now that first table leg is my pattern for the other three. And now, how to attach those? And I just can't be bothered with putting in a dado blade for just a few dados that aren't that wide. This part is going to fit into a slot on the legs here. I just don't need to cut that. Now I just got to round over the edges of the table legs before I glue them together. And also rounding over the edges of the pieces that tie the table legs together. Now I just need a way of attaching these leg brackets to the bottom of the table, and for that I made these plywood things that go on here, and the legs get screwed to those, and then that gets screwed to the bottom of the table. For big screws in the end grain like this, I'm going to need some pilot holes. Now just using some screws and a hammer to transfer the pilot locations in the hardwood trim. I don't need pilot holes in the plywood itself because that's poplar, but that trim is maple, so I definitely need pilot holes for that. And attaching it with just 2 screws for now because it'll come apart again for varnishing. Now without an apron rail going across, it has more flex than some of my other tables, but it's strong enough for the kids. This is a good height for the kids now, but as they get bigger, I might want to make those legs a bit taller, which is why I made the ends wide and square so I can just attach a block of wood to the bottom to make it taller. And the round over on the table edges, I like to do that late in the process in case I ding it up. And then the varnish. First the tabletop, then the other parts, and then another thick coat on the tabletop. And I'm real impatient, so I put a couple of heaters underneath the tabletop to help it dry a bit faster. And checking that with the infrared camera, the heaters are hot, but if I get those out of view, you can see how the tabletop is so much warmer than the rest of the shop. And I prefer to scrape instead of sand between coats as much as I can. That doesn't get the sandpaper so gunky because I'm impatient. And now a second and final coat on everything. And now I can put it back together with all the screws in it this time. And some felt pads for the legs. I like to hot glue these on and actually take the felt pad and I cut the self-adhesive layer off of them because the hot glue works so much better. And here it is set up. I put some plastic on it for when the kids do watercolor because that's always messy.